Bruce Lee did not lose that night. That much was clear to everyone who stood close enough to see what happened. What was never agreed upon, then or now, was how a 240-pound Olympic judo champion failed on her first attempt, and why Bruce Lee left the room without a word, while the crowd stayed behind, arguing in whispers for years.
Los Angeles, California, United States. A private judo training hall behind a community athletics center. April 17, 1969, Thursday, 9:41 p.m. The room was already crowded when the doors were closed. Not crowded in the way official events are, no rows, no seating, no sense of order, but dense with bodies standing closer than necessary, filling space that was never meant to hold this many people. Shoes were stacked unevenly near the wall. Training bags leaned against one another like they had been abandoned mid-thought. The air carried the familiar smell of sweat, canvas mats, and something older, wood that had absorbed years of impact. There were no tickets, no sign-up list, no announcement posted anywhere in the building. Everyone present had arrived through a separate chain of information, none of it direct. Someone had heard something from a coach. A trainer had been told to come by tonight. A journalist had been tipped off without knowing exactly why. Each person arrived believing they were early. Each realized, upon stepping inside, that they were not. Conversations stayed low, short sentences, unfinished thoughts. Names were mentioned, then dropped. The tone suggested caution rather than excitement. More than one person later recalled the same feeling, that whatever this was, it wasn't supposed to be watched. The lights were on, but not fully. The center of the mat was clearly visible, while the edges of the room sat in partial shadow. Faces appeared and disappeared as people shifted their weight. No one warmed up, no one stretched. That absence alone unsettled the experienced eyes in the room. Bruce Lee entered without ceremony. There was no pause when he arrived, no signal that something important had changed. A few heads turned, some slower than others. Bruce Lee was smaller than many expected, about 5'7", lean, compact, his weight later recalled as somewhere near 140 pounds. He wore simple training clothes, nothing to suggest rank or authority. No belt, no jacket, no visible marker that placed him above or below anyone else in the room. He didn't look around for acknowledgement. Those closest noticed that he scanned the space the way someone evaluates a surface, quietly, quickly, without expression. Bruce Lee moved to the side of the mat and waited. He didn't sit. He didn't speak. By then, the whispers had already adjusted. His name didn't circulate loudly. It passed mouth to ear, often paired with uncertainty. Some spoke of his speed. Others dismissed him as a film actor who trained too much. No one seemed able to agree on what he actually was. What everyone sensed, though, was that Bruce Lee already knew why he had been called there. A few minutes passed, then more. The crowd grew still, not because someone demanded silence, but because the room itself seemed to be holding something in reserve. The expectation was no longer whether something would happen, but whether anyone would stop it before it did.
When she entered, the room adjusted without being told to. The female judo champion did not raise her voice or announce herself. She didn't need to. Her presence carried a familiarity that only comes from rooms like this, training halls where hierarchy is felt rather than explained. She was tall for a judoka, broad through the shoulders and hips, her weight later repeated by witnesses as just over 240 pounds. The build was functional, not ornamental. Everything about her suggested years of controlled force applied without hesitation. Several people stepped back instinctively to make space, not out of fear exactly, but recognition. This was someone whose body carried authority before her reputation was even mentioned. Her credentials circulated quietly, as if everyone already knew them but felt compelled to confirm. Olympic-level competition, national dominance, a reputation for throws that did not rely on momentum alone. She was known for first attempts, clean, decisive, final. More than one former training partner had been injured not because she was reckless, but because she did not adjust once commitment was made. The mat felt smaller when she stood near it. She removed her shoes carefully and placed them side by side, aligned more neatly than anyone else's. She rolled her shoulders once, slowly, as if checking nothing more than comfort. Her expression was neutral, almost bored. There was no sense of anticipation in her posture, no tightening of the jaw or narrowing of the eyes. To her, this was familiar territory. People watched her more closely than they had watched Bruce Lee. This was the authority figure the room had been waiting for, the known quantity, the one whose outcomes were measurable, repeatable, supported by structure and recognition. When her name was spoken, it carried weight. When Bruce Lee's was mentioned beside it, the contrast felt deliberate. Some in the crowd began reframing the situation immediately. This wasn't about proving anything new, they told themselves. This was a demonstration, a correction, a reminder of reality. The room leaned toward her by default. She glanced once toward Bruce Lee. The look wasn't dismissive, it was appraising, the way experienced fighters assess balance, limb length, center of gravity. She saw his size, she saw the absence of visible rank, and whatever conclusions she reached, she kept them to herself. Bruce Lee did not respond. He stood where he had been since entering, arms relaxed, weight evenly distributed. He did not mirror her posture. He did not prepare. Those closest later said that if they hadn't known who he was, they might have mistaken him for an observer rather than a participant. That imbalance, the room aligning itself around the champion while Bruce Lee remained unclaimed by either side, created a quiet tension that no one addressed aloud. By then, it was clear, this was not a meeting of equals in reputation. It was a meeting between established authority and something the room had not yet decided how to classify.
No one could later agree on who said it first. Some claimed it began earlier that week, in a separate building, after a training session that had already run long. Others insisted it happened the same night, just outside the hall, spoken too casually to be intended as a challenge at all. What everyone agreed on was that it did not arrive as a declaration, it arrived as a remark. A single line, spoken without volume. Something about whether technique could still function against real mass. Something about leverage failing when the difference in weight crossed a certain point. The words were not recorded, only the effect remained. That line moved faster than the speaker expected. It passed through trainers first, then through students, then through people who had no reason to repeat it except that it sounded unfinished. Each retelling sharpened the edges slightly, not by adding bravado, but by removing context. By the time it reached Bruce Lee, it no longer sounded like a question. It sounded like an assumption waiting to be corrected. No formal challenge was issued. No agreement was written. There was no moment where both sides stood facing each other and defined terms. Instead, the room did that work on their behalf. Someone mentioned that if it were to happen, it would have to be private. Another added that cameras would only interfere. A third noted that there should be only one attempt. Anything more would turn it into practice. None of these suggestions were disputed. They were accepted in silence,
the way rules sometimes are when everyone senses they favor the same outcome. Bruce Lee listened. He did not interrupt. He did not clarify what he was being asked to do. Those standing near him later said he asked only one question, and even that was quiet enough to be missed by most of the room. It wasn't about winning. It wasn't about fairness. It was about whether the attempt would be honest. The answer came from someone else, not from the champion herself. Yes, they said. One attempt. That was when the tone shifted. Up to that point, the gathering could still be mistaken for coincidence, a group of professionals occupying the same space for unrelated reasons. After that answer, the room understood that whatever was about to happen would resolve something that had been hanging unspoken between them. The female judo champion did not object. She did not renegotiate. She did not ask for additional conditions. Her stillness read as confidence rather than hesitation. To her, the terms seemed unnecessary to debate. Bruce Lee nodded once. It was not approval, it was acknowledgement. From that moment on, the challenge no longer belonged to either of them. It belonged to the witnesses. The room leaned inward, not physically, but mentally, each person aware that they were about to see something they would later be asked to explain without proof. And for the first time that night, the silence felt deliberate rather than accidental.
There was no signal to begin. No referee stepped forward. No count was given. The people closest to the mat later said they only realized it had started because the quality of the silence changed. Breathing slowed. Shifting stopped. Even those who had been leaning against the wall straightened without realizing why. The female judo champion moved first. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't aggressive. It was the same forward commitment that had defined her career. Measured steps, shoulders aligned, weight already settling into position before contact. She did not rush. She did not hesitate. This was not an attack. It was an execution of something she had done thousands of times. Bruce Lee did not retreat. He didn't lower his stance dramatically or widen his base in any visible way. His posture remained almost unchanged, upright enough to look unprepared to anyone expecting a defensive crouch. Those who understood balance noticed something else. His feet were already where they needed to be, though no one remembered seeing him place them. The space between them closed. There was a moment, later described inconsistently, where it seemed as if nothing happened at all. No audible impact, no sharp movement that could be pointed to afterward, just a brief convergence of mass and intent. Then the attempt was over. The champion had committed fully, that much was clear. Her arms were engaged, her hips turned, her center dropped exactly as it should have. By all conventional understanding, the outcome should have followed. It didn't. Bruce Lee shifted his weight by an amount so small it escaped most eyes. Not backward, not sideways. It was described later as a removal, as if something essential had been taken out of the equation rather than opposed. The throw never completed, not because it was blocked, but because it lost its reference point. The champion's balance broke first, not dramatically, not violently, just enough to end the attempt. Her feet adjusted, then adjusted again, searching for ground that was no longer where it should have been. She released instinctively, stepping back to prevent a fall that never fully arrived. The room didn't react immediately. People waited for continuation, for a correction, a second attempt, an explanation. None came. Bruce Lee had already disengaged. He stood exactly where he had been, breathing unchanged, eyes lowered slightly as if the moment had passed before it registered as significant. The female judo champion remained still. Her posture was upright, but something in her alignment had shifted.
Not physically damaged, nothing like that, but recalibrated. She looked at Bruce Lee again, this time without calculation. The look was shorter, quieter. No one spoke. What unsettled the witnesses most was not that the attempt failed, but that it failed cleanly. There was no visible struggle to reinterpret, no ambiguity that could be blamed on timing or miscommunication. The rules the room had accepted moments earlier had been satisfied, and the result had arrived without excess. Bruce Lee took a step back, not as a gesture, simply as someone stepping out of a space he no longer needed to occupy. Only then did the room realize that the demonstration was already finished.
The first sound came from the crowd, not the mat. It wasn't a gasp or a shout. It was the low, uneven noise people make when they begin speaking before they know what they want to say. A few voices rose, then stopped. Someone laughed once, abruptly, as if to test whether laughter was appropriate. It wasn't. The female judo champion did not react outwardly. She stood where she had recovered her footing, shoulders squared, hands relaxed at her sides. To an untrained eye, she looked unchanged, uninjured, unembarrassed, fully capable of continuing. But those who had spent years in similar rooms noticed something else. She did not reset. In judo, after a failed attempt, the body usually moves before the mind. Grip is reestablished, distance is corrected, the system seeks another solution. None of that happened. She remained still, as if waiting for information that never arrived. Bruce Lee did not offer it. He had already stepped away from the center, returning to the edge of the mat without drawing attention to himself. There was no acknowledgement of victory because there was no claim of one. His posture suggested that, for him, nothing remained unresolved. That contrast unsettled people. Some in the crowd leaned toward the champion, expecting a response, a word, a request for another attempt, even a dismissal. Others watched Bruce Lee more closely now, searching his movements for explanation, for something they could later describe as technique. They found very little to work with. The champion finally spoke, but not to him. Her words were quiet and brief, directed at no one in particular. A statement about footing, about timing, about how the surface felt different than expected. Each explanation sounded reasonable on its own. Together, they failed to reconstruct what had just happened. The room began to divide. A few witnesses nodded, grateful for language that restored order. Others shook their heads, not in disbelief, but in refusal. They had felt the absence where resistance should have been. They had seen an outcome without effort. No explanation offered to them afterward fit what they had observed in the moment. Bruce Lee listened without interrupting. He did not correct the explanation. He did not deny it. He simply waited, eyes lowered, hands still, as if the conversation belonged to someone else. When it became clear that no second attempt would be requested, he adjusted his stance slightly, an unconscious signal that he was preparing to leave. That movement carried more weight than anything said aloud. The champion noticed it, so did the crowd. The realization spread quietly. Whatever authority the room had granted her earlier could not compel continuation. The decision was no longer hers to make. Bruce Lee nodded once to no one in particular. Then he turned and walked toward the exit, retrieving his shoes from the pile near the wall. No one stopped him. No one followed. The sound of the door closing behind him was unremarkable, but several witnesses later recalled it clearly, as if their memory had marked it as the end of something that had not been named. Only after he was gone did the arguments begin in earnest. Some insisted it had been a misunderstanding. Others claimed the champion had held back. A few said the floor had been uneven. Each explanation worked best for those who had already chosen what they wanted to believe. What none of them could explain, then or later, was why confidence had left the room so quickly, and why it had not followed Bruce Lee out the door. There was no official record of the night. No report was filed, no photograph surfaced, no statement was released by anyone who had been present. By the next morning, the room had returned to its normal use, the mats wiped down, the shoes gone, the air cleared of whatever tension had briefly settled there. And yet, the story did not disappear. It moved quietly, the way certain accounts do, never announced, never written down in full, but repeated with care among people who understood what could and could not be said publicly. Trainers mentioned it in passing to other trainers. Fighters referenced it indirectly, never naming names unless they were certain of the listener. Journalists heard versions of it, but could never place it within a format that editors would accept. The problem was not disbelief, it was classification. Those who were there struggled to explain what they had seen without reducing it to something familiar. If they framed it as strength versus strength, it sounded inaccurate. If they described it as technique, it felt incomplete. The moment resisted language. It had been too brief, too clean, too devoid of struggle to fit the narratives people relied on. Bruce Lee did not speak of it. In later interviews, when asked about demonstrations, challenges, or private encounters, he redirected the conversation toward training, research, or philosophy. He never denied the event, he simply gave it no place to land. For those who knew the story, that silence confirmed more than any admission could have. The female judo champion continued her career. Publicly, nothing had changed. She competed, taught, and retained her standing within her discipline. But those close to her noticed subtle shifts. She became more selective about demonstrations, less interested in comparisons, more cautious about absolutes. The confidence remained, but it had acquired edges. Years later, when asked indirectly about encounters with smaller practitioners, she spoke carefully about balance, about variables, about moments when systems fail without warning. She never mentioned Bruce Lee by name. By then, the room no longer existed as it had that night. Renovations had altered its shape. The lighting had changed. New generations trained there without knowing what had once unsettled its walls. Only a few of the original witnesses could still point to where the center of the mat had been, where the silence had gathered. To outsiders, the story sounded exaggerated. To insiders, it sounded unfinished. What gave it endurance was not the outcome, but the restraint surrounding it. No one had tried to capitalize on it. No footage had surfaced to settle arguments. The event lived entirely in memory, reinforced by the fact that those who spoke of it rarely agreed on details, but always agreed on one thing. The first attempt had been enough. And in the years that followed, as Bruce Lee's public image grew larger and more symbolic, that night remained stubbornly small, a private moment, witnessed by few, resistant to spectacle. Not a lesson, not a myth, just an absence where effort had been expected and where something quieter had taken its place.